fishies and the mama fishy too.
Swim!
Said the mama fishy.
Swim if you can!
And they swam all over the dam.
Boop, boop, didn't dot'em wad'em. Two!
And they swam all over the dam.
Stop!
Said the mama
Or
fishy.
you will get lost!
But the three little fishies didn't want to be bossed. So three little fishies went off on a spree. And they swam right out to sea. Swam right out to sea. Yeah, the little fishies. So they swam and it was a lark till all of a sudden they met a shark. Got him, got him. All of a sudden they saw a shark.
The EscapeGoat podcast. A podcast series featuring the discussion of many different topics, flaws and all, based on personal whims and fascinations. Hosted by me, David Fagiani, and several different guests. Hello and welcome to the EscapeGoat podcast, episode 55, part 1. This is going to be a two-part episode featuring two different discussions with two different guests on roughly the same topic, or at least in the same zone. And I'd just like to welcome my two guests tonight who are returning to the podcast, Mr. John Canfield. How are you?
Hello, I'm very well, thank you.
Yeah, good to see you again, John. And for the first time on the EscapeGoat podcast, I'd like to welcome Mr. Simon Barraclough.
Hello, lovely to be with you guys.
How are you today, Simon?
I'm pretty good. Yeah, I've listened to you two before and I've known John for many years, so very happy to be here.
Very, very good to have you with us. I'll just, I'll get straight into what we're planning to talk about tonight, and I think it's going to be quite a long and rambling discussion because we're all quite interested in the topic, and I think you've both got a wealth of knowledge and insight to bear on it, no pressure. And that is the 1975 Steven Spielberg classic Jaws, which is a sort of ludicrously overanalyzed film. So we're really, I don't know why we're
really is.
on this. But it's been me and John were discussing ideas for EscapeGoat episodes. I think probably last year, and I think we've probably been chatting about doing something along these lines for over a year now, John. Actually, I think it's come up probably first in the pub. And we've got, as I say, we've got another great guest coming back for part 2, hopefully. But yeah, firstly, me, John, and Simon, we're going to talk about several aspects of the movie. I think we're sort of vaguely organised, but we're going to ramble all over the place as well. And we'll just get going with that. So I think we'll start with you, Simon, give you a debut guest courtesy. Just talk a little bit about your sort of personal background with Jaws, when you first encountered it in your life.
It's a really good question. I think of myself as like a first generation Jaws viewer / encounter. Now, the first people who kind of saw Jaws were baby boomers. I kind of slip into the next generation, the Gen X. So I was kind of born in '66. Jaws came out in the UK in '76. So I think Jaws came out in the UK on Boxing Day, '76. But before that time, it had a lot of press. And even though I was like a school kid growing up in Yorkshire at the time with in a family who really liked cinema, but were by no means call them cinephiles or particularly sophisticated in their viewings. We were a working class family. We knew of this film, and it came out on Boxing Day in '76. I think we saw it about 8 weeks later, so we had a kind of latency period. So I was 9 years old when I first saw it, which is ridiculously young if you've seen the film. It was an A certificate at the time, which is a preposterous mischaracterization of the context of the film, I think, when you look at what actually happens in it. And also, about 2 years or 18 months before, I'm half Irish, so my mother's Irish, so we would go to Ireland a lot on the Sea Link ferry or occasionally on the aeroplane. And I saw the paperback copy of this book called Jaws at either an aeroplane bookshop or the little single carousel you often got at a Sea Link ferry kind of bookshop. And it's still the same today. If you take the ferry from I don't know, from Portsmouth to St. Malo or whatever, there'll be a little concession shop there with sweets and deodorants and a little carousel with a few books on it. So I saw this book that said Jaws, and it had like a picture of a menacing looking thing on it, and a woman swimming above it, and it said, "Now a major motion picture." Or it said the alternative was like something along the lines of a deadly terror and a town that can't face the truth, which is why I think Ibsen is an enemy of the people is often invoked when it comes to the Jaws film screenplay. Quite rightly, because it is a very similar model. But I saw this book, and it kind of intrigued and terrified me. So I was already kind of weirdly hooked as an 8-year-old child, 7 or 8-year-old, going to Ireland, possibly on a Sea Link ferry over the sea, with this notion of what is this thing, and what is a major motion picture, and in fact, what is a motion picture? Because I saw in Huddersfield in the 70s, we called going to the cinemas going to the flicks. So a film was a flick or it was a picture. So like a major motion picture, I don't know what a motion picture was. I don't know what a major motion picture was, but I saw this compelling thing, and it just kind of went into my very, very young and malleable brain at that time. And then probably about 18 months later, the film started making this extraordinary noise, and it came out, and lots of people at school were talking about it, and the BBC were, they covered it on what was the Barry Norman series, Film 75 or Film 76. It had clips on it. Everyone was talking about it at school. The poster was everywhere, and I was kind of weirdly mesmerized. There was one night, probably in like February, maybe 76, when we always had like tea. We called it tea. Me, my mum, my sister, and my dad would have tea, whatever it was, shepherd's pie or egg and chips or whatever. And my dad kind of pushed back his chair at about 7 o'clock one night and said, "We're going to see Jaws tonight." And we'd been pushing to see Jaws for a couple of months because it was the only kind of thing happening in town. It was in all the newspapers. There were like little black and white versions of the poster. And I remember I always loved going on holiday. I always loved like Christmas morning. And like when my dad said, "We're going to see Jaws tonight," it was absolutely the most exciting moment of my childhood life, without a doubt. And we immediately went into both the kind of excited and panic mode. It's like we knew terror lay ahead. We knew darkness lay ahead. It wasn't just, "Hey, here's a good trip. We're going to go and see a film." Because we'd seen other films. We'd seen Oliver. We'd seen, I think, Live and Let Die by that time. We'd seen Earthquake. But this was like something else. This was like, this is a massive cultural moment. And I'm really excited, but I'm really terrified. but I must do this. And that's kind of how it started. And I can tell you more of that, but maybe John wants to interrupt.
Yeah, well, I think there's a lot to pick up on in the show there, actually, including, I think we'll probably return, well, to what a major motion picture is and the ways in which Jaws helped, famously redefine that in the 1970s.
Yes.
There's also something just delicious about encountering that obsession on a ferry, isn't there?
Yes, exactly.
That's just
Exactly. And then returned because a few years later I went on a school trip to Germany about 4 or 5 years later on a ferry. And the kind of awe and terror that Jaws inspired in me, which is probably borderline psychotic, was still working through me 5 years later when we went to Germany on the ferry. And I was convinced that ferry was going to sink and we were going to have like an Indianapolis type experience. I'm not even, you're smiling. I know it's funny to you. And I get that. I was convinced to the point where I tried not to go.
Yeah, that's I want to talk about the Indianapolis later.
Fucked up.
With some sounds like it. Well, this podcast is, amongst other things, therapy officially.
Good. I need it.
So
I still need it.
So John, I mean, what's your background with Jaws?
I've thought about this, knowing that you were going to answer that. I'm not sure. The Jaws came out in the year I was born, or was showing in the UK in the year I was born. So I definitely didn't see it then. I can't remember when I first saw it properly. However, what I can remember being in my bed as a child, and based on where I was living at the time, it's definitely pre-10, and I'm assuming it's maybe 7 or 8, maybe even younger. And I remember having really terrible nightmares that Jaws was going to get my feet. So yes. I couldn't let my feet go out of the bed because I was terrified that it was gonna bite. But I'm almost certain that I hadn't seen the film at this point. But as you said, Simon, it made such a big noise from then onwards. I suspect that I just kind of absorbed it by osmosis in some way. It may even have been, one of the sequels on TV that I caught a bit of. So that's the earliest memory I have on it. But I think I then just came back to it much later. I suspect it may not even have been until university when I was studying film. And at that point, it becomes part of the whole story of film and the whole narrative of the 70s and everything happening, that I have a suspicion that I came to it spoiled almost, because I already came to it with this weight of expectation of what it had done for movies and who Spielberg was and had gone on to become. So I have a much less virgin experience of Jaws than you do, Simon. I think mine was I kind of came to it much later, and I came to it sort of with all of the knowledge that it has. That said, I came to a lot of films during that period that I don't tend to watch at least twice a year, whereas Jaws remains one of those films that I will almost certainly watch at least twice a year. So it's then gone on to have a different, more profound impact than maybe a lot of other classic 70s cinema that's equally as important, but kind of less enjoyable.
It's I find it interesting, John, that because Simon, you're encountering it as a child, but as a direct cinematic experience and all the hype surrounding that, that first experience. John's encountering it a little bit more sort of secondhand, but almost having it sort of having dissolved into the culture almost a little bit more. And I think, I'm a little bit younger than John, just a little bit, and it's kind of by that point it's just playground folklore. You can by the early 90s you can be in a primary school playground and people just be going around going da 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 da, to signify threat of any nature. And it's just kind of there's something, I probably grew up watching parodies of it on Animaniacs and Tiny Toon Adventures and things like that. Tiny Toon, both of which shows Steven Spielberg had a hand in, I've just realized. But it's proper sort of pop cultural folklore there, isn't it? And it's almost developing that footprint overnight in the 70s because it was such a big hit and such a big cultural product.
There's a kind of purity to having seen it on its first release, which I often say to myself, hey, I wish I had a time machine. I could go back in time and I could watch like The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari the first time, or I could watch Psycho for the first time, or I could even, I mean, this is actually within my perspective, I could see Taxi Driver for the first time. And it's like, these are amazing kind of cultural moments. But I did see Jaws for the first time, you know, and it was an absolutely unforgettable experience, kind of psyche and emotional altering event. But it was still very, very significant for John a few years later, seeing it on VHS or television. But there was, I mean, even I was prepared to a certain extent, because the film had been out for a couple of months. For something that my father was a big film fan, so we would watch a lot of films at home. We would watch, you know, Edgar Allan Poe, Roger Corman films on a Friday night. He'd let me stay up and watch those. Probably too young, but you know, they made it still have a huge impact on me. Wonderful, beautiful, poetic films. I am a poet, and they're part of that experience. And on a Sunday afternoon, after Sunday lunch, we would watch like John Ford westerns on BBC Two or whatever. But we would go to the cinema maybe like 4 or 5 times a year. And Jaws was like, but it was seen as like, this is a really important experience. Going to the cinema, seeing something on this scale, this kind of size. And the thing about Jaws was, I knew kids at my school had seen it already. They were talking about it. Everyone was talking about, I had a sense of like what shocks were coming up, what happened. I knew that there was like a head under a boat, a head in a boat. That's all I knew. You know, you know what I'm talking about.
Was that playground talk basically? That was your playground spoilers for it, yeah.
Yeah. So some kid would say, "Oh, we saw Jaws last night. Oh, really? Did you? Wow. How was it? Well, it was like amazing thing that happened with like a shark, a boat, and a red boat, and there was a head. There was a head in a boat. It's like all kind of completely incoherent childhood kind of chatter. But there's a tank. There's a tank at the end, and I was like, tank? What? What kind of tank?
Yeah,
of course it was
to bring in the army to fight the shark.
Of course it was, yeah. It was the compressed air tank, you know. So there was all this kind of stuff was kind of in the air, but it was like seeing it for itself, even given all that chatter, all that kind of like radio non-silence, was still utterly unexpected, immersive, overwhelming.
Yeah, no, I can only imagine the amount of marketing, clever marketing that was behind that as well, to have that kind of impact.
You know, but as a 9-year-old kid, obviously the marketing was there. We had, you know, the poster was there. There were, I remember I used to check the Huddersfield Examiner. I grew up in Huddersfield in West Yorkshire. I used to look at the cinema adverts, and it was, you know, they had little pictures, little black and white pictures of like the Jaws poster, or late nights. It would be like Suspiria, Argento Suspiria, whatever, all this kind of crazy. And it was like a weird world, different world to me, a kind of adult world I only had limited access to. But Jaws kept coming through. And it was like, this is something that's happening in our cultural lives that we absolutely all have to be in touch with. It's kind of crazy when you think about it.
Yeah, I was having this conversation in a slightly different context recently about another 70s landmark, you know, commercial and, you know, in some ways artistic landmark, Star Wars. And I was just thinking that
Right.
once you sort of try and, as much as anyone can who grew up with it and stuff, as much as if you try and actually look at Star Wars as a thing, as what the original Star Wars was, it's a crazy concoction. You know, like it's this film that shouldn't work at all, let alone be wildly successful. You know, it's a film nerd. I mean, I know it's a popular serial pastiche, but it's a film nerd collection of jokes and references, and it's not, you know, and it's ridiculously camp and ludicrous and trippy, and you know, it's all sorts of things that shouldn't work at all. And Jaws is kind of the same. And I was thinking that, you know, in terms of like unlikely, you know, mainstream cultural dialogue successes and stuff, the other thing I could think to compare Jaws to, you know, later would be something like Silence of the Lambs, maybe, not just in the sense of it being based on a popular novel, like in some sense it's a sort of, a sort of what might be considered a trashy novel by some critics, but turned into this massively respected and very, very commercially successful work. And, Silence of the Lambs is equally grisly and has very strange adult perverse themes and things like that, and Jaws is almost,
Really?
because Jaws is, well, I think we'll talk more about this, but Jaws is such a strange entity, isn't it? Because it's sort of the start of something. Famously, it's the start of a new sort of filmmaking and way of marketing and making films and releasing them. But it feels like the end of something. And I think I want to talk, so aesthetically, I want to talk a bit more about that.
It ended as it started. It killed off something as it gave birth to it, which I think is interesting. In the same way that I think The Exorcist did, and possibly Alien did. It's like, well, we're telling a really popular story here, but we're telling it in such a style that means it cannot be told this way again, because it's kind of too much. In a way, I mean, the fact that Jaws was an A is fucking mind-blowing to me. When an A meant in 1976, an A meant that you could take your 4-year-old child to watch this film if you had a parent there. And I went with my mum and my sister and my father, and so I was 9, my sister was 12. And we saw things that terrified and disgusted all of us. I remember looking around to my father and him being absolutely terrified. Ben Gardner's head appearing out of the hole in the boat, which is a completely brilliant but utterly unnecessary scare moment. And also the whole, Quint's death. I was thinking about this at the weekend. I was thinking, well, what is a worse, more prolonged, more bloody, more agonizing death on screen than Robert Shaw's death in Jaws? And the only thing I could think of was, it wasn't a single person's death. It was several persons' death at the end of Taxi Driver, which was made in the same year. How did that get passed as an A? Why was I allowed to see that? I'm quite happy to have seen it as a 9-year-old because it was one of the great moments of my life. But I'm not sure I should have seen that.
Yeah, I think we'll get back to talking about the nature of Quint's demise when we talk about the characters in a bit more depth in the second half of this. But that was a famously grisly bit. It's the most violent bit in the movie, and
I still can't watch it without. And I've seen it 100 times. I still look away.
I'm pretty sure, I was a bit vague on this, but I'm pretty sure me and my brother were at a certain stage allowed to watch this. I know it's a film particularly my mum was very intimidated by. She'd seen it at the cinema and she was too frightened. So frightened she had to leave, basically, at quite an early stage in the movie.
Yeah.
But my mum and my dad knew that the Quint bit was one of the most extreme bits, if not the most extreme bit in it. Well, it is the most extreme bit in it. And I think we might have been able to watch quite a lot of it, but not that bit on initial viewing. It was something like that was fast forwarded for us or something.
It was probably edited on ITV in the 80s or whatever. They probably trimmed it a bit. If you're going to show it, don't fucking trim it.
Yeah.
If you're going to go there, let it happen. Anyway.
It's an unbelievably cruel demise for one of the 3 main loved protagonists by that stage in the movie, isn't it? It's I can't think of much equivalent to it, really.
And also, it's not only is it that, it's the cinematic climax of what is possible. We've set up this thing, we've set up this means of demise, and we've given you, all the pros and cons. Is it visible? Is it working? Is it not? Is it editing? Is it whatever? Is it Hitchcock? Is it all that kind of stuff that goes on with Jaws? But it's like, whatever we have done, we have decided to show this demise in a 1-shot or like a 2-shot extended passage. But it's like, this is no fucking joke,
Yeah.
This is what this film is about. It's about devouring protagonists, the audience, on a certain level. I mean, it's so audacious. The fact that it still works, and I think it still does work, is astounding. It shouldn't work, but it does, because of character and menace and threat and build-up. And the fact that, Quint talks about, the thing about shark, it's got black eyes like a doll's eyes. This is a doll. This is a doll. It's a puppet, and it's killing him. And he knows that a puppet can kill you, and we know because he's told us that puppet can kill you. And then we see a puppet killing him, and we completely believe in it. And I certainly did as a 9-year-old, and I watch it now as a 56-year-old. I still fucking believe in it. I still look away.
We might be skipping ahead a bit too much to focus on just the death, but I think there's an element here of the technique and the directing as well, and finally seeing the shark in that moment. But a lot of this, a lot of kudos has to go to Robert Shaw as well. I think for the fact that the characterization all the way through is just this world weary. I have the answer to everything. You're all fucking idiots. You're either rich boys or naives, and I'm the only one who knows what's really going on here, and it's me and the shark. But it's after all of that, when it's that scene when he steps out, gets me every time when he comes out and he flings the life jackets at them. And obviously we've had the Indianapolis speech at that point, and he gives them the life jackets, and he comes out and he's got his shirt done up. And it's the first time we see him looking in any way presentable, where he doesn't just look like a tramp, basically. He comes out, he's got his shirt done up, he's looking fairly well. He knows that this is like it's like he's dressed up for his final act. He's dressed up for his very final act. But then everything slips away. It's the moment where he's hanging on to the door of the cabin with his feet, frantically kicking against the wet deck, that you suddenly see and you hear, now he's scared. Suddenly he is genuinely terrified because he knows what's coming, and all of his bravado and all of his world weariness and all of his ability to say, I'm not scared of those beasts. And, there's the whole Ahab Moby Dick going on up to that point. It's when it switches to the pure fear, and then it's immediately followed by just the most blood-curdling scream, and the shot of the blood coming out of his mouth just tips everything over the edge. But everything in that kind of 1 minute sequence is just precision timed to give you that scare, to give you not just that scare, it's a psychological terror.
I completely agree, and I think you've just voiced very well why that scene works so effectively, and in part why the character of Quint works so well. And I just wanted to bookmark one thing and then sort of build on that a little bit. The thing I want to bookmark is you mentioned Taxi Driver before, Simon. When we talk a little bit more about sort of masculinity in this movie.
It's very interesting to me that these two guys were recreating American 70s cinema, one of them in the most commercial way imaginable, and one of them in a much darker, more independent way, leaning on Cassavetes and all kinds of European morals of cinema, and yet they were both, which is just what we're doing,
No, I want to come back to that because, again, when talking about the male characters in Jaws and, kind of their search for, I guess, what they're capable of in a sense. And, the idea of going on a quest as well, that's sort of a twisted version of Taxi Driver, or rather Taxi Driver's a twisted version of this. But I would... Absolutely, yeah. But in terms of 70s cinema, and this is, as with most of these things, I'll caveat this and say, this is going to be far from an original thought. But on my rewatch of Jaws last night, at quite an early stage of the film, at the beginning actually was Halloween. And this was because...
Oh my God, that's interesting.
I mean, it's partly because the film starts first person from the point of view of the killer thing, which is how Jaws starts, basically, during the overture, essentially. And that's how Halloween starts. Halloween starts through the eyes of its revealed child, Michael Myers. And that took me back to, it's funny you mentioned Quint as well, because I was also thinking of, Dr. Loomis in Halloween, someone who's had experience of this horror and is traumatized by it, is obsessed by it. And the real weird one is, I mean, it's obviously Halloween came out after Jaws, so it's in that direction if it's anywhere, but it's, Loomis talks about Michael Myers. He says, he has these eyes. It was like the devil's eyes, And Michael Myers looks like a doll as well, doesn't he? Michael Myers is, famously the mask in Halloween is a resprayed William Shatner mask.
Yeah.
But he looks like a China doll come to life, doesn't he?
Yeah.
And there's something there about, and the way the music's used in Halloween as well. And, clearly Jaws is taking stuff from, Bernard Herrmann and, it's that. But I mean, one just before that, in terms of precedence to Jaws, one thing I was thinking of that I'd never thought of before in terms of Jaws, and particularly where the score is used to characterize the shark, is Peter and the Wolf.
Yeah, which I fucking love. In fact, John, I wrote a poem. John had a David Bowie anthology, and I wrote a poem about Peter and the Wolf.
Indeed.
So we're overlapping already on that.
I mean, there are bits in Jaws where clearly that the music, the iconic score that I've already quoted a bit of, I mean, that's it sort of it characterizes and personifies the shark in a way that I can't think of many other scores doing for outside experiments like Peter and the Wolf doing for a specific antagonist. So, I mean, although actually that might be a thing. That's another similarity to Star Wars, really, isn't it? Where you get sort of like the Imperial March coming in. It's like these.
I'm weird. I'm a weird person in that I genuinely have not seen any Star Wars film all the way through, and I know that's a terrible indictment. And I will correct it soon because why the fuck not? I've got nothing against it. It just so happened that in that time of the 70s, when I was an overwhelmed and extremely excited cinema kid, I saw Jaws and Close Encounters and The Thing, and I went down a certain pathway, and I never really picked up the Star Wars thing, but I do recognize that they're great films, and I must watch them. But I think that's John Williams and Bernard Herrmann is that when people think of Jaws, they think of the EF. They think of that. Like, it's not even a tone; it's a semitone. It's like the most basic. It's like the lowest notes on the piano. It's the lowest notes on the guitar. And it's great. It works brilliantly. It really does. But if you listen to all the moments where the score kind of explodes, where Chrissy's attack in the first 3-4 minutes, you get lots of hyper vibrant circling Bernard Herrmann type strings. You get a completely wildcat xylophone running up and down, atonal scales. And certainly, if they're not atonal, they're modal scales. This is sophisticated. This is really sophisticated music. And then when you see like the 4th of July, all that stuff going on, it's an incredibly sophisticated score that John Williams did, and he probably didn't need to. I think this is the kind of artist John Williams is. It's like, well, yeah, I can give you your key terror moments, but can I also give you, oh my God, it's like a version of fucking Peter Gynt, or it's like Tchaikovsky's Third or something. It's like, I can do that. I can do that for you. And it's amazing. If you listen to it, it's incredible. And sometimes it kind of oversteps the mark. I think some of the later scenes when they're hunting down the shark and it's and you got Hooper and the barrels flying and whoa, hey, I'm having a great time. I think it's kind of a bit too much, but it works. It works well, and it speaks to. I think one of the things we maybe wanted to talk about is like what kind of fucking genre is this film, And I think the music defines to a certain extent what the genre is.
This is the bit you picked up on is the bit that I always pick up on that strikes me as slightly incongruous, and it's when they shoot Jaws with the barrels, and you first see him fleeing with the barrels, and then suddenly it does become it's all very major key, and it's all very uplifting. Yeah, there's a couple of interesting things happening there, though.
I'm still really depressed about all these people have been killed in a really miserable, violent, horrible way. I'm still seeing a guy's leg floating down to the bottom of the. So where is this coming from?
They're still in danger, that's the thing. But with the music, with the Williams soundtrack coming in, there's a couple of things happening there. So there's, I think, what John Williams and Steven Spielberg's working relationship becomes for the rest of their careers, let's be perfectly honest, is the idea that they can make you feel exactly what they want you to feel when they want you to feel it, to an extent. If you put a different sound music cue under that moment where they attach the barrels to the shark, and if it's a more downbeat or threatening one, you don't get the same sense of hope and optimism that maybe they're going to pull this off.
I don't want any hope and optimism. That's the thing. I don't want it. To me, the film to that point has been one of like absolutely depressing, jaded horror. I don't want your like, hey, isn't it great? Isn't it great pursuing the animal that destroyed Alex Kintner? I always feel like kind of a bit weird about that. Although I do appreciate the fact that these guys get a bit of a break, because who doesn't need a fucking break, you know? And they've got nothing but tension between them. They're all hyper tense. None of them get on. None of them are from the same socio-economic background. They have the same like goal, but like, of course it's a problem. But I don't want any fun. You've ripped off the leg of this guy like 10 minutes earlier. You killed that girl in the first 3 minutes. That I'm still a bit traumatized by, to be honest. None of this is to say that I don't absolutely fucking love the film in all its respects and to its very denouement.
I think
that's coming across. I
think that's taken as a given, Simon. I don't think that's a concern. The other thing that gets me every time, and I don't think I would have been clever enough to have cottoned onto this on a first viewing, but the other really clever moment is when the kids play the prank. We don't know yet that it's a prank, so you see the camera coming up from below. But there's no music because there's no shark.
Exactly, because they're being honest about the music.
It's like that would be a step too far. Would be pretending the iconic Jaws shark is there when it isn't. You know,
honest about the music. That's a really interesting way of putting it.
The shark is there. That's the rule. Yeah?
I just want to pick up on what both of you were saying to an extent, but what John was getting at there, I think, with Williams and Spielberg working together to manipulate us and create a certain mood, and why that mood is there. Because I noticed that, I think the first time I watched it as an adult, I was like, this gets very light and springy at this point. I know exactly what you're talking about. And I think, and this is interesting actually to talk about Spielberg, because this is kind of Raiders as well. Boy's Own Adventure, right? It suddenly turns into a cheery adventure novel. Men on the high seas being men going, but they're boys, really. That they're living this fantasy for a second there. They're riding the waves. They're working in tandem. That it has become a game in that moment, and I think that's not a mistake. I think because then they're going to hit tragedy and they're going to hit hardship, and it's going to get the better of them. At least before the climax. And I think that's meant to. I think that's deliberate. I think that's meant to show you that these men are like almost literally out of their depth.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I think that's a brilliant insight. You need that. The thing about we talked about earlier, like what kind of genre is it? Is it a horror film? Is it a thriller? Is it whatever? I mean, there are so many genres you can throw at this film. I think it's a horror film that becomes a kind of adventure thriller, and then returns to being a horror film. And the way it returns to being a horror film is through the Indianapolis speech, and then the cage sequences, and then Brody's final confrontation. But the only reason that it can return to those deep, dark notes of the horror film is because it's hit them so early. And the early 15, 16 minutes, I think, are incredibly scary, out of control, nothing to do with the setup of the town, of the scene, of the people. None of the Ibsen-esque kind of stuff. It's like, well, this is the pure force of horror that's come, and it's created. I mean, the opening demise as Robert Shaw would call it, my third wife's demise, the opening demise. I watch it now and I've seen it, 70 times over the years. I still think it's genuinely horrific.
Well, because I only saw Jaws I last saw Jaws less than 2 years ago, shortly after watching The Shark is Broken, by the way. We can get onto that later.
Oh, yeah.
But I rewatched it this time, and I'd forgotten how horrible the girl's death is, because there's a lot more, it's hard to say realism necessarily, isn't it? But there's a lot more kind of pathos in it than a lot of sort of what you come to think of as slasher movie deaths, shortly after this, because she's really pleading. And there's something heartbreaking about both her actual terror, but then the way she just disappears so abruptly as well, and is instantly, the sound is snuffed out, because that's what drowning is.
The final note, talking about John Williams again. If you listen to, of course, you've got the and we're into the main title sequence, but then you get the whole Chrissy sequence scene, the time on the beach, and the harmonica and the guitar and all that stuff. And the final note of Williams' score after Chris's demise is that's it. It's the final moment. She goes under. That's also when Williams' score disappears, and you've got nothing there. And it's like, well, we are in the emotional hands of absolute sadistic manipulators of emotion.
I think there's a parallel there to the way with Bernard Herrmann in Psycho. Yeah. There's a parallel to the way Janet Leigh is almost literally attacked by the score. As you witness her death, the score fades.
Yeah, I think Herrmann would look at the beginning of Jaws and think, "Oh my God, that's what I wanted. That's what
what I meant to say was." Had Hitchcock passed away when Jaws came out? I lose track of.
No. No, in fact, he's famously known for making some jokes about that fish form was whatever.
That probably shows he was quite rattled, I'd imagine.
I think he was very rattled, and the thing is, Spielberg and Scorsese and Coppola and all those guys were like absolutely in the throes of Hitchcock, and rightly so. If you watch it again, if you just the only thing you do after listening to this podcast is to watch the first 3, 4, 5 minutes of Jaws. Listen to the fucking glockenspiel,
That's the first time someone said this on this podcast, but it won't be the last.
I'm not kidding. It's unbelievable.
I want to ask you both something about this film's resonance in the present day in a second. Maybe a predictable question, but I think it's one we'd be lax if we didn't get around to. But I just wanted to. John's going to laugh. I just wanted to bring up Star Trek.
Ding 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 ding.
Yeah. So I might mention this to John in conversation. So I was rewatching some Star Trek the original series before, so an episode from 1968, which I'm not sure if Spielberg or Williams had seen, but it's one of the more fondly remembered episodes of the original Star Trek series called The Doomsday Machine. Now that episode, I won't go into huge detail here, but that episode's about a planet killer machine, which is basically a giant maw, like it's a machine. It's like a Galactus-esque devourer of planets that's shaped like a giant tube that goes around, like eating planets with its fiery mouth, essentially. And the way that's presented, I mean, people have pointed out, in a lot of it, Star Trek has a lot of, Moby Dick in its DNA, and they often do sort of Moby Dick obsession stories, and mad captains who are obsessed with monsters, essentially. And that's one of the very first Star Trek ones where they go down that well. But the way that's just presented, as I say, this is a piece of 1968 popular television. The way it's scored is almost exactly I think it's and you see, and this machine, it seems to be unthinking. It works like a shark. It threatens the ships in the same way, the starships in this case. But the way they actually defeat the Doomsday Machine, spoilers for 1968 Star Trek episodes, is they basically find out that by putting things in its mouth and then detonating them, you can destroy it. So they do that with a small thing, and then they do it at the end with a larger thing. And they managed to destroy it by essentially, it might as well be exploding a capsule in its mouth, essentially. So I have no idea. I wish I'd found some indication of whether Spielberg has ever name checked that, or indeed the author of the novel. Spielberg has ever name checked that.
Freudian.
Yes, yeah, another Star Trek reference. But it was unignorable for me when I watched that episode. I was just like, this in terms of mood and kind of the malevolence conveyed by the score for this alien creature. That's pure Jaws. The question I want to ask you is how does Jaws resonate for you in 2023, having come out the other end of a pandemic?
What a great question.
Yeah, it was much memed at the time, wasn't it? That actually Larry Vaughan's behaviour of wanting to keep the beaches open was very similar to that of our government wanting to keep everything open despite the risk. I mean, it was a fun, amusing parallel to draw, but as Simon referred back to Enemy of the People, it's this sort of narrative, this sort of story of, it's almost capitalism versus socialism, isn't it? It's, money versus the well-being of people is not a new narrative and not a unique narrative to Jaws or many others. So I feel like that parallel aside, I feel like any parallels with, what we've been through in the last couple of years are, well, I don't know, are they flimsy as I say that? Because you've also got the idea that the power of Jaws and the fear of Jaws comes from the fact that it's natural, it's not man-made. It's up there with kind of disaster films that are focused on weather events. It's something that you cannot stop. It's something that you have no logical control over. You have no way to reason with. You have no way to, call authorities who are trained to deal with this sort of thing. So maybe in that sense, yes, maybe the pandemic comes into play there as well, because it was this natural event that took everyone by surprise, and no one really had a playbook for how to deal with in any way at all.
I really like, sorry, Simon, I'll let you come in on there in a second, but I just, I was just going to, as a sidebar, say that one of the things I quite like about Jaws, and obviously this would have been very different, very easy to do in either the source novel or the film, is you can easily make this into a Godzilla type thing, can't you? A sort of post-nuclear thing. You could make it a supernatural shark, a shark, well, either actually supernatural or a mutated shark, a shark that is larger than is actually possible. And I really like the restraint with which both the book and the film don't do that. It's a freakishly large shark, but it's not actually something that doesn't exist. Or, the model, you could argue about the model's accuracy to actual sharks and stuff like that, but it's not that sort of thing. It is something from nature, as you say.
They do go down, like, there's touches of that in the novel. There's a speech where Hooper talks about, well, if there's a shark this big, maybe there's still a megalodon down there. How would we know? And there's this, this passage where he's genuinely talking about maybe megalodons still exist, because we never thought until this day that we'd see a shark this big. So what's to say that there isn't a 30, 40 foot shark that's so far down in the deep? So yeah, it's got elements of a kind of not apocalyptic, but elements of escalation, that this could just get worse and worse and worse and continue and into the slightly fantastical of, does this prove that dinosaurs still exist?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think there's elements of, as with a lot of horror movies, that in the dark there are things we do not know of and maybe should not know of, so it manages to have a supernatural vibe about it without actually having to fall back on or create an actual supernatural plot. But yeah. Simon, do you have any thoughts on that?
In terms of the non-existing or fantasy type level of these creatures, I think Jaws, for me, as a 9-year-old in 1976, was kind of both. Was terribly real and terrifying, but also kind of mythical and beautiful.
One thing I was going to say when we were talking about, first about the sort of COVID or accidental COVID echoes these days, was I love, because the mayor is one of the more iconic characters outside the central trio from Jaws. And I'm just saying, I actually really love that actor's performance on this rewatch. I think he's because he's remembered as a sort of boo-hiss villain. and he
Yeah.
is that, and obviously represents these corporate and commercial and governance forces that make mistakes like this. But he's also just a guy, like he's not a particularly brave guy or anything like that. But I love how broken he is. And it's not even at the climax of the film. The easy thing to do would be, bring him down at the very end, have him go to jail or something like that. I love that he's just, when the scale of the bloodshed that he's been accidentally complicit in, or complacently complicit in, is apparent.
Yeah.
He's kind of a broken man. Like Brody has to talk him into signing these documents to pay Quint and sort the situation out. And I love his line. He's like my kids were on that beach too. He's like kind of. But he's not really angry, and he's not really that righteous anymore. He's not really trying to win an argument. He's just like, I am a human, remember? And I was really impressed by the nuance there.
Exactly. I love Murray Hamilton, and I love Mayor Vaughan. He's actually a very nuanced character, and he does have children that he cares about. Dostoevsky says, "Love the animals. God has given them the basis of thought and an untroubled joy." And this is the thing. All right, so God has given them an untroubled joy. This is the thing that the shark coming into Amity understands. That's all it does. Untroubled joy. It's going to take what I want, and it's fine. That's all I'm going to take. Everybody else takes a certain power above them, but the shark is like, I'm just here to do what I do.
It's exactly what Hooper says. Hooper says, all this shark does is it's a machine. All it lives for is swim, eat, and make little baby fish. That's it. And that's the fear of it, that it doesn't want anything. It can't be rationalized with. It can't be bargained with. It doesn't want anything other than to swim and eat and procreate, and that's it. And the fact that it's so destructive, the fact that it is so powerful and able to kill so indiscriminately, is where the power, I think, where the primal fear of this comes from. In fact, I think there's an interview where Spielberg calls it that. He says, I wanted to make a primal scream movie. Basically, it was something that was just so utterly primordial that couldn't be fought against, and that's where the fear comes from.
Well, John, it's interesting that you echo forward there when you're saying it can't be bargained with, reasoned with. You're echoing kind of the iconic Kyle Reese speech in Terminator there, aren't you? About the nature of the Terminator. But I was thinking also, looking forward to one of my favorite movies, Alien. The admiration that Ian Holmes' character Ash has for the alien in that, talks about it as being the perfect organism.
Yeah.
And obviously Alien comes only a few years after Jaws, and similarly there you've got this that slightly more fantastical, well, very much more fantastical creature, which is also contrasted with the complicated, messy human, working class human characters who have, complicated lives. And this thing doesn't have a complicated life. It has a very, very simple purpose. And as joy in life. We must imagine Jaws happy.
Yeah, I've actually just found the quote from Spielberg. This was an interview he gave when he was actually making Close Encounters, but he was talking about Jaws, and he said, that he'd said to himself, I'm going to make a primal scream movie. When I first got involved in the project, the thing that terrified me the most was the idea that there's something else out there that has a digestive system with intake. And the whole idea of being on somebody else's menu was just utterly horrifying. It was a horrifying thought to be part of a food chain. Jaws is a raw nerve movie. It's just bearing your nerves and saying, this is about the birth sac you swim around in yourself.
Wow. I think we'll break for the second half in a minute, because I could do the glass of water, but I just wanted to briefly talk about, because Spielberg's not seen as a horror movie director very often, but two of the movies, and some others might come to mind for you too, but
he is.
Well, yes, it was
to me.
certainly is in this, and I think even in things like Raiders, obviously, you've got the
best work.
Yeah. Well, you've got the climax of Raiders, obviously, with the Ark of the Covenant scene and things. What I was going to bring up was movie even predates Jaws, Jewel, the Early Spielberg movie with the where basically
Great film.
essentially a
Great
guy
film.
is being chased by a killer truck, with
Yeah.
not much explanation as to why. But then I was also thinking forward to, because one of my favorite Spielberg movies is it's not to everyone's taste, but is the mid-noughties War of the Worlds movie.
I love that film.
Yeah, I'm very keen on it as well.
First hour is
I'm lukewarm, everyone.
Yeah, I don't think it's perfect, but I think in terms of popular blockbusters of the noughties, I think it's pretty high up there in terms of some of the artistry in it and the mood of it. And I think that's
not going to go with like, what's the most extreme mainstream Hollywood film you could conjure at the moment? That's it for an hour.
Yeah, well, it's interesting if Spielberg, as the quote John read suggests, if Spielberg is sort of primarily attracted to and knows the power of these reminders of people not being at the top of the food chain, or civilization not being at the top of the food chain necessarily. I mean, War of the Worlds is one of the classic kind of anxiety expressions of that, isn't it?
Yeah. Yeah,
something interesting about him being drawn to that.
Yeah, that's a good parallel.
War of the Worlds is brilliant film, I think. One of like 3 Spielberg films I really rate.
Well, it's got, I can't remember if this is exactly from the book. I think it's at least suggested in the book of War of the Worlds, but there's bits in that movie, aren't there, where the humans are being sort of pulled up into the machines, being kind of essentially devoured by the machines. Processing of kind of a vague nature.
Well, Wells is utterly merciless, Spielberg, he's like almost there with him.
Well, maybe Jaws, both the novel and the film do something for the kind of anxieties of mid-70s America. That Wells was tapping into for the late Victorians.
Jaws is Spielberg's most extreme kind of expression, I think. He never really got back to the horror of the Alex Kintner child murder. I mean, very few people have done that. I mean, not even Carpenter in the opening scenes of Assault on Precinct 13 have achieved that kind of, well, this is what we can do actually in storytelling.
Yeah, I suppose I hadn't thought of
We can destroy everything. We can destroy everything you've thought of.
That, if you're talking about bad things happening to little kids, don't look now, obviously.
Yeah. In a funny way, Jaws is worse, because it's like, well, you got to set up. There's a beach. There's people. Everyone's having a good time, and then this happened.
Yeah.
In the John Carpenter film, it's like, well, boom, bang, it happens. Both of which are brilliant, I think, by brilliant filmmakers, but doing different things, having different effects.
Well, I think we'll break the first half there, and we'll go and get a cup of tea, and then we'll come back and talk a little bit more about Jaws, and we'll talk a bit more specifically about the lead characters primarily in it, because I kind of want to talk a little bit more about them in detail. See you after the break.
It's 2,000 miles to the planet, Flynn. Closing fast.
Bridge, transporter operational, but this jury rigging won't last for long. He's got to come off now. I'll stand by here.
1,500 miles in closing.
Captain, transporter operational, but just barely.
Prepare to beam me aboard on my signal. In closing.
Transporter, stand by.
Steady by, sir. Miles in closing.
Scott. 20 seconds to detonation. Mr. Scott. Mr. Scott. Try inverse phasing.
60, 50, 40, 30. Gentlemen, I suggest you beam me aboard. 10, 9, 8,
Mr. Scott.
6,
Fire now, Mr. Kyle.
5, 4.
Welcome back. So, John, Simon, I just want to talk to you a little bit more. We touched on a lot of this already, but a little bit more about the characters, particularly the main characters in Jaws, by which I mean the sort of central male trio that are at the heart of particularly the latter half of the film, the boat voyage, this being Brody, Hooper, and Quint, but we'll sort of dance around all over the place a little bit. And I think we might want to make some reference to the recent play, which some of our audience might be familiar with, The Shark is Broken, as well. We'll get a bit more into why we want to talk about that, but it might shed some light and illuminate some of the things we're talking about both the characters and the actors in question. So first, I want to talk to you about Chief Brody, played by Roy Schneider in this. And I guess we can talk a little bit about Brody's family as well, sort of his general setup, because all of these men have very different sorts of social setups. And you talk about their different socio-economic backgrounds before, Simon, of course. Let's start with you, John. What are your thoughts on Brody and the way he is portrayed in the movie?
I've kind of ruined myself in terms of having just read Jaws for the first time, and I'm now struggling to slightly to reconcile the characters as they are in the novel and why they became the characters that they are in the film. I think it's almost, you could read the book and then see the film, and it's almost a textbook example of how to cut things out of a novel. But with Brody, I think they do some really clever but very, very minor changes with him. I'd say Brody is probably, well, maybe Quint as well doesn't change particularly either. But they change him from someone who is an islander and is the chief of police and has been the chief of police for years, but they turn him into an outsider and they turn him into a newcomer. And I think that gives him and us as an audience, it gives us the in. And this is the key factor of Brody, I think, is that we are seeing things through his eyes for most of this film. We are seeing the fear and the terror and the panic through his eyes. And we're on his side in terms of when Mayor Vaughan is trying to shut down the beaches, because we have the knowledge and the information, and we've seen what this shark can do, whereas Vaughan has not. But he comes across as, again, we're going to bring up enemy of the people. He comes across as the one good and true man who is going to stand up for the rights of the people. But I think it's very interesting that they made him a newcomer and an outsider, and they play up a lot of the elements with Ellen, for example, that they have not been here that long and that they're from New York. And there's after the attack on the beach, when he says, let's take him home, and Ellen says, what, to New York? This idea that he has been kind of dropped into to everything that's happening. He's been dropped into this world, and it's all it's completely unknown territory for him. They also throw in all these elements about him, hating water and not being able to swim. He's just, it's strange, isn't it? Because I think the three male characters, in a way, are just stereotypes to an extent. They are just tropes. However, the details that they give the characters, to flesh them out and to make them more fully rounded. It is the small things like, you know, Brody's relationship with his wife, and the, you know, those lovely little scenes with his children, the scene where he's with what's the youngest kid called, but where he's, you know, pulling faces. They're at the dinner table and he's pulling faces with him, and there's just really lovely moments and really lovely details where they really humanize Brody, and they make him really quite an intriguing character, but obviously the character that kind of contains our hopes and our emotional investment, and that we'll continue to root for all the way through. There's a moment that I know, well, maybe I should let Simon point this out, but every time we've watched it together, you were the first person who ever pointed this out to me, and there's this lovely little moment, and it's the skip. You know what I mean by the skip? It's when he's going to, is when it's the parade is on, and he's on his,
the skip,
the little skip.
Well, it's much earlier. It's like it's way before the little scenes with his youngest Sean.
Thank you.
I think he's his youngest child. So when he walks out of the Amity police office early on, in like the scene, I mean, like, he walks up the road and he skips. He fucking skips.
It's just this
Nobody skips in 70s or 80s cinema. Nobody. But Brody skips. He's like, here I am. I'm up from New York. I fucking hated it there. Every day there was a shooting, and you know. But he thinks it's great. He thinks it's fine. I mean, I love Brody, but it's like he's setting himself up for absolute horror.
Well, he's a family man, isn't he? And you know, you picked out.
Yeah, the only family in Jaws, I think, because we have. I mean, Larry Vaughan has. He says, "Oh, you know, my kids were in that pool too," but nobody else mentions family at all in Jaws. But Brody does, and we see them up front. And of course, if you follow the lamentable sequels, I think by Jaws 4: The Revenge, which I think is better than Jaws 3 by some distance, young Sean is killed by a shark. You know, might be a vengeful shark. It might be part of the Brody legacy. It's like the House of Aetus. It's like Aeschylus. It's like, you know, the Oresteia.
Yeah, there is an increasing sense that goes on with it, as I seem to remember with the film sequels, that the family is in some way cursed, that there's a curse upon the House of Brody somehow.
They are definitely cursed. They are cursed in a way that the House of Atreus is cursed in Greek classical tragedy. There's no other comparison.
I just want to talk about something John was mentioning there about, you know, Brody's role as, you know, as this figure in this community, and, you know, the incomer, but also obviously he's the lawkeeper. You know, he's the chief of police. You were talking before, Simon, about what genre Jaws is, or what genres it's made up of.
Yeah.
And that gives it, that's because he's protecting this community, you know, deserving or not, you know, from this marauding bandit, basically, isn't it? It gives it a very Western feel, you know, that thread of it. He's kind of a Western character, isn't he? He's actually kind of one of the more modern Western characters, in the sense that they started problematizing their masculinity from sort of, you know, the 1940s onwards as well, you know, because he's not a macho man.
Absolutely, I think it's to do with the Western genre, in the way that Taxi Driver is to do with the Western genre, and that 70s moment is like, well, how do we deal with this? How do we deal with this?
But I suppose there's the whole second half of Jaws really is about getting a posse together, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, the animal turns up. It's like very much like Hooper at Brody's house. You know, he hasn't been invited. They're already halfway through their dinner. He turns up and he says, "Well, hey, is anyone eating this?" And that's his like intro. And like the shark is exactly the same. He swims into Amity Harbor. He says, "Well, hey, there's a naked woman at 3 a.m. Is anyone eating this?" And he devours it. Is anyone eating this? It's just like a kid on a lilo. It's like, well, the shark is there. It's like, well, I'm here. All I'm doing, exactly the same as Hooper, is I'm inviting myself in to this place, and I'm going for that. You know, the more I watch it, I'm like, well, what's wrong with that?
Well, I think the three characters' attitudes towards the shark are interesting because they're all scared of it in differing ways. We touched on Quint a bit already before. We'll get on to
Yeah.
Hooper in a second. But Brody, the way in which Brody is trepidatious about it, obviously he sees the damage it could do, and he has this, quite from an early stage, a healthy respect for the damage it can do. But he seems to be quite fascinated by it as well, doesn't he? Like, I think he's the one who reads out the bit about sort of how evolutionarily set sharks are, isn't it? That's the thing everyone always says about sharks. That they've been the same for millions of years. And he
Brody's
reads up
the only
about
person who learns about sharks. He
Yeah.
reads the books, and it's much like the Benchley novel. It's like we learn everything from the books.
Yeah, it's a bit like, it's not quite as far in the direction of Ian Holm in Alien, but it's not that he's like occultly fascinated, like enthralled to it or anything. But he is. There's something seductive about the terrible beauty of it, I suppose.
Yeah, Holmes' view of the alien is definitely the most interesting take on it, I think.
Yeah, that's one of my favorite bits about it. We haven't got time for this, but that's my favorite, one of my favorite aspects of Alien.
Yeah.
Many.
There's a lesser take, which is, you know what, that beautiful view means we're doomed. But an actual view is like, this is the perfect thing.
Yeah, I think, again, talking of terrible beauty, like, that sort of appreciation of something that you can only get by practically being in its mouth.
Yeah.
I mean, I think all three of the men with differing degrees of experience and insight are all kind of under that spell in this movie, really, aren't they? And it comes back to you, John, saying about the spells that Spielberg and Williams weave. The fact that they all feel like, the cliche of a Spielberg movie is people looking in wonder at things that are then revealed, right? There's less of that visually in Jaws with the shark itself because of the fact that the shark had its deficiencies. So it's wonderfully hidden for a lot of the movie. But in terms of mood, that wonder is there, isn't it? But it's a very dark wonder. Coming back to what Simon was saying about this being Spielberg's most horrific movie, arguably.
Yeah, but how do we feel about when the shark is actually visible?
Oh yeah, well, yeah. Do you want to do a brief sidebar on that now? I mean, I watching it last night, I was thinking it still works for me in almost every bit. I think there's some bits in, obviously the shark's barely seen at all in the first half of the movie. I think in the boat chase near the end, there are bits where it's in long shot, where it's a bit too, it's in daylight and it looks cool, but it's clearly not a shark. So there's that, there's that. I think that those are the bits where it comes nearest to breaking down for me, I think.
Well, I mean, there's not much. There's been a lot said about, the shark and the effect on that film of the fact that this fledgling animatronic shark didn't work when they wanted it to do, and they couldn't get the shots that they wanted. And again, on a wider level, I think it's this very interesting exercise in a great film comes out of not being the film that they necessarily wanted to make. Because if the shark had been working, then we'd see a lot more of it. We'd have lots of, perhaps different scares, different shots of it. It's a film we're never going to see, that we're never going to be able to compare it to. But the fact that it takes so long for us to see the shark is obviously the power of the film, is where it comes from. And it's the fear of the unknown, and it's the fear of the unseen. And coming back to the soundtrack again, actually, I'd be very curious to know, presumably the Williams score was commissioned and written after the rushes or after they had a cut or whatever, and how much heavy lifting the John Williams score and the first person POV camera shots are doing. You almost don't need the shark more than you have it there. I think it appears the perfect amount of time. It never really bothers me. It never really hinders me that occasionally it looks marginally less realistic than at other points. But that at the end of the day, I think someone said that at the end of the day, you kind of know that Quint is being eaten by a puppet, and you go into the cinema kind of just taking it on trust and on faith that Quint is being eaten by a puppet, by a fake shark, and it almost doesn't matter how believable that is.
I think that bit completely works, actually. But but as we said before, when we talk about Robert Shaw selling the performance here, that's part of it. Obviously, there's an element of Bela Lugosi in an Ed Wood film wrestling with an octopus. Obviously, there's that kind of thing. But I was thinking actually, because while we're still normally talking about Brody, because Brody is amongst other things a sort of a comic character. A lot of them are in various ways. But one of the big shark reveals is the bit where he's putting the chum in the water. The famous bit where the shark rears out of the water behind him, as he's kind of looking away, and his reaction to that, it's a jump scare, but his reaction to that is one of the funniest expressions in the film. Isn't that sort of iconic Roy Schneider bolt upright look that he does? That's like something from a slapstick movie.
He's also got a fag hanging out of his mouth. He's smoking as he's chumming, and he jumps back up, but the fag just stays kind of dangling out of his mouth, and it's a complete double take, isn't it?
It's one of the scariest bits of the movie on a sort of visceral level, but also one of the funniest. The way it's played, which is an interesting combination.
I mean, if he had a beer in his hand, you'd imagine he'd do a kind of beer double take, beer back to the shark, beer back to the shark. But
yeah, well, it's a great moment, isn't it? Because they're using the shot model there, and you're revealing it. I think coming at that point, the nearest to directly revealing it, that it's really been, and it is terrifying, but it is also, he literally doesn't. It's so overwhelming that he can't even be conventionally scared. Almost, you're not exactly sure what he's experiencing in that moment because it's just so crazily unexpected. Yeah, Simon, do you have a final thoughts on Chief Brody? I guess before we move on to Hooper.
Yeah, his line, "You're going to need a bigger boat." It's not funny. Absolutely devastating. He sees everything that's coming.
You think that's his prophetic moment?
It's not a funny film. It's a traumatizing, devastating film. And that's probably his final. Apart from the final shot he makes on the barrel as the shark is coming towards him, that's his final word.
Well, it's if you're, I like your interpretation of that as being a dark moment, and obviously it does presage disaster, but. That's another bit of blending of comedy and tragedy, then, isn't it? Because that's also one of the more iconic lines from the film.
Yeah, it's an uplifting film that devastatingly bleak. I think, and when my favorite moment from the whole film is when Scheider is like, "Well, hey," and he's laughing, and he's uplifted. And then the camera stays on him, and his face dissolves into complete desolation. He's seen what's happened to Quint. He imagines what's happened to Hooper, and I think that's Spielberg at his best. And it's well, actually, you know what? I can give you these entertainments. I can give you these as many as you want. Jurassic Park, whatever's coming your way, even Schindler's List. I'm going to leave you with bleak despair.
I wonder if there's an element of survivor guilt, or if we're moving.
But if it
is,
then it's re-spoken. It's reignited by Quint, because he is the biggest example of survivor guilt we've seen in modern culture.
That moment you're talking about when he kills the shark, and that's great, but then there's this moment of just everyone. I've survived. I've managed the elation of killing the shark.
He thinks Hooper is dead. He's seen Quint die. He's seen Chrissy, the little boy. Everything is, and the thing is about that shark exploding, because of the information we've had about the tiger shark and this slow metabolism, and hey, anything that's been in there is there for 24 hours, whatever. That explosion, you've got Chrissy in there, you've got the little boy in there, you've got the boy, you got the Labrador, you've got the guy, you've got Ben Gardner, you've got the guy. They're all in there, because that's actually how slow the shark's digestive system is. And it's of course, you don't think about it when you're watching it in 76, but a couple of years later, you're thinking, well, he's sprayed with that. He's living in that. He's swimming through it with Hooper. All those people's body parts are there. It's awful. It's like it's one of the most horrific moments in any horror film, which is what brings us back to, is it a horror film? Is it a thriller? Is it an adventure? Whatever. I think it's a horror film that becomes an adventure film that ends up as a horror film.
Yeah, it can, like the shark itself, it can use anything. Briefly to the narrative point you were both talking about Hooper's surprise survival at the end. That's another example of, in a good way, Spielberg manipulation, isn't it? Because you get to do that, and in a sense, it's a cheap narrative surprise, but also you do get to end up on an upswing, don't you? You do get to end on a positive note.
You do. And this is classic Spielbergian. This is his weakness, I think, as a storyteller.
And it sometimes works against the movies in question. We talked about War of the Worlds before. I think one of the weakest aspects of that movie is the ending, where the happy family unit is put back together after what you just witnessed. That probably should not be the ending.
Yeah, but the thing is, what you witnessed means that the family reunion means nothing. This is the perverse step that he takes, I think. It's like, well, things are so extreme that no matter how I finish this, it's not really going to matter that much. And I think that's something that is in the play in Jaws and Close Encounters. And he hasn't quite resolved it, And I think he's someone who doesn't really resolve his stories.
Well, let's get on to talk about Hooper, because you were talking before about what happens when you cut open a shark, the sort of forensic evidence, if you like, the evidence locker that they all are innately by what they do and the way they hunt. Hooper's an interesting character, isn't it? Because in a way he gets to come in and be the sort of CSI Amity kind of character. It was actually, it's funny. Totally would watch. It's funny, I didn't mean to draw this link before, but when I was talking about Silence of the Lambs, obviously that's a part of the fascination, and obviously the plot of Silence of the Lambs is that kind of horrible, what's inside bodies, what points clues towards other things. A lot of the first half of Jaws, especially when Hooper enters, is working out exactly what they're dealing with, through this sort of evidence. Hooper's an expert character. He's he knows his stuff on sharks. He's also a younger man. I suppose he's a little bit younger than Brody, quite a bit younger than Quint, and he's not a family man. He's a young single guy as far as we can see. And he's Richard Drake's place.
He's like he's a very wealthy part of the 1%. Which I think is interesting. Because Quint is clearly underlined several times working class figure in the film, and Hooper isn't. And they still have things that draw them together, which is kind of, it's very progressive actually. I think, because they do end up in the film at least sharing certain worldview. It's like, well, how can we together solve this problem? Whereas before they can't.
Well, it's sort of a masculinity as it's portrayed as a sort of joint venture, right? You have to have a thing to do together. You have to have a team sport. You have to have a thing that, draws people who might not have much in common together to get in a goal, something like that, And I was actually thinking it's funny, again, talking about masculinity and different ways of men getting on together. Obviously Quint and Hooper are set up antagonistically, and that's a good laugh for, the whole first 2/3 of the movie. But in the scene, the much loved scene that sort of climaxes with the Indianapolis speech from Quint, obviously you've got a lot of cutesiness there as well. They're getting drunk together, another classic way of male bonding. You've got them talking about, the one-upmanship over the scars is both hilarious but also kind of melancholy, isn't it? Because these men are literally bonding over their damage.
It's a very beautiful. It's an amazing sequence, and I wish we'd dwelled on it more actually, because it comes out of 10 minutes before you've got the attack on the guy in the estuary where his leg is severed and drifts down to the, and then 10 minutes later you've got, hey, we jig our legs, and then it's like, well, we're in a world where personalities, bodies, identities are being torn apart and dismembered and falling apart, and yet we still have this ability, even though we're so different, we still have this ability to kind of bond together. And the thing is, it's brilliant screenplay writing, but it's also really fucking maddening in terms of how masculinity might work itself out. It's like, the shark, don't show up now. Don't attack the boat now, because we're getting somewhere. And the thing is, all these guys, Brody included, who hasn't touched his food, if you notice, there's all this food on the table. Quint, Hooper have eaten their food. Brody hasn't touched his food at all because Brody is like sick with anxiety. There's this thing going on, and the shark is like, well, I'm gonna. And the thing is, I don't think the shark is male or female. I think the shark is a. It's like, I don't think it's right to think about it as a bad thing in nature. It's a psychological eruption, and it destroys this beautiful equilibrium between the three males. Well, the three males that we most care about, I don't know what you two guys think. I think Quint, Brody, Hooper, I think we care more about them at that point than we do about the shark.
I completely agree with that. I think if this film has a heart, it's that scene. Pure and simple. And it's not just because it leads to the Indianapolis speech, but also that is a crucial and a phenomenal moment where everything just shifts a gear, but also the way that everything that leads up to that moment, and we've had over an hour of Quint and Hooper going at each other, and there is a class war happening here. There's a class struggle happening,
and it's fun. It's fun. And,
exactly. At one point Hooper says, "I've had enough of this working class hero crap,"
and yet they still care about the thing about. I mean, one of the weird things about my early childhood terror of the ocean because of Jaws is that I did become a trained sailor. I've got a competent crew certificate because I really wanted to know how boats work. The thing is that I'm scared of boats. I've been on them, but I have trained how to use them. So
you're sailing into the wind of your fear there.
Jaws even ate through that. Do you know what I mean? It's like Brody would probably never take a sailing course, but he'd been through this shit, and he's like, "Hey, I've been through that." As he says in Jaws 2, he said, "I've seen one of the things up close. I don't want to go through that hell again." But he wouldn't take a course, whereas I took a course. I took a course because I was like, I was worried. I was worried.
Yeah, well, we've touched on concepts like survivor's guilt, and trauma, and we talked a bit about sort of 70s masculinity as emerging as a different thing to the generation beforehand. There's an awareness in Jaws that these men are all, even just dealing with the present situation, they're working through something, but they're all dealing with their own, what we now call positionalities, and their attitudes towards the situation and each other. And it's like you were saying before, that they're all from different backgrounds and they all have different prejudices against each other, and they do talk over each other a lot and stuff, But as you say, the more successful moments of bonding, like the scene in the cabin on the boat, they're succeeding because they are listening to each other and they're respecting each other and they're telling each other about what their perspectives are. And even, I was talking before about them comparing their scars, and to an extent that being macho bullshit, but also a way of bonding. Well, and the thing that leads into the Indianapolis story is that he's removed that scar, right? That's, a tattoo is a scar. And that's one step too far for him, right? Quint, that, out of some sense of trauma or respect or reverence or, spookedness in a way, that's not visible, but the moment he says the name, Hooper's like, awestruck, and terrified at the name Indianapolis, it's a cursed name. But they listen to his story,
and they listen to Brody. Brody is the one who needs to hear, because Quint knows what it is, Hooper knows what it is, Brody doesn't. So Brody is like, he's kind of our ears and our eyes to things, isn't it? I mean, I don't want to overstate it, but he's he's the one who needs to know what that is.
They're kind of a perfect triumvirate, aren't they? Just the more we talk about the differences and the similarities, and in a way the narrative purposes of Quint, Hooper and Brody, at various times you have different things going on, but you have Quint, who is the no nonsense, working class outsider, who doesn't really play by society's rules and isn't really educated to Hooper standards, just gets on with his life. But he's got the raw experience of being at sea, and he's, as we find out, he's the only one who has genuine first-hand experience of dealing with sharks. You've got Hooper, who's got all of the actual knowledge and all of the actual information, who can talk about where sharks came from, and you know that it's a perfect machine eating. And Brody is in between because he has absolutely neither of those things. He's completely ignorant about the entire situation. He has no experience and he has no knowledge, but yet he has the power and the drive and the personality and the stakes, in actual fact. I think he's the only one with stakes, really, isn't he? Hooper doesn't really care about the people of Amity. He cares about the shark. Quint doesn't really care about the people of Amity because he's an outsider. He's a loner. Brody is there because he wants to stop the shark, because his job is to protect the people of Amity. And in a way, that triumvirate gives you everything you could ever possibly need. You could go anywhere with all of that. It's like the perfect diagram of how to put three people in a room and give them the perfect status and the perfect background so that you have covered all of your bases.
Well, I actually feel we're not that far away from invoking the old, maybe slightly hoary id, ego, superego thing, right? You know, that's sounded what you were describing a little bit there. But I think it's true though that you mentioned Brody there. He has stakes. He's also got guilt, right? I mean, because I talked about the mayor character before, but Brody to an extent has gone along with this. He is partially responsible for the deaths that have already happened. Unnecessarily to the citizens of Amityville. He didn't do it. He arguably didn't do enough to speak up, and at the times it would have mattered. Yeah. And he certainly feels that way, I think. And
well, we know that because he says it, and we believe it when Kittner's mother comes and slaps him in the face and says, "You knew, you killed him." And I think it's Mayor Vaughan that says, "That's not true, Martin." And he says, "Yes, it is.
Yeah.
Like truly heartfelt and utterly sincerely, he is carrying that guilt because he knows he must accept some responsibility for it. Even if he tried to stop it, he didn't stop it. And does that mean that he just didn't try hard enough? And that's the guilt that he's got to carry.
Yeah, and he's putting his life on his line, and obviously not that family men's lives are worth more than any other lives or anything like that. But he is essentially running the risk of making his wife a widow and losing his family, losing their parent, as well. So there's all this stuff on the line specifically for him as well. I think we're not going to get around to it more organically than we were just talking about the cabin scene so much. John, would you like to briefly describe what because we referred to it briefly before, what The Shark Is Broken was, and because I think in talking about the interaction between the three men, that's a good sidebar to hit at this point.
Yeah, it's I'm trying to think how old it is. Simon, I remember us getting tickets for this just before the pandemic hit. So it was The Shark Is Broken.
Yeah.
It's a play by...
It was, and then it was around my birthday, so 2 years later. So like 2021, I think we saw it.
Yeah, so I think it was in Edinburgh at the Fringe maybe the year before that. So maybe it would have been, might even have been, so it would have been about summer 2019, I reckon. So it's a play by Ian Shaw, who is one of Robert Shaw's sons, in which he plays Robert Shaw as well. The original version in Edinburgh probably would have been like a tight 1 hour play about the making of Jaws, and it's focusing on those three characters and those three actors. And as we know, because the shark was broken, they spent a lot of time sitting around. So they spent a lot of time just sitting around, chatting, waiting for things to get set up. And much as we've just said with the kind of Hooper, Brody, Quint dynamic, you've got an equally fascinating dynamic with those three actors, because you've got Robert Shaw, who is primarily the quote unquote name. He is the only really established name at that time. Dreyfus has come off the back of American Graffiti, and is kind of on record as saying he thought he sucked And once he'd seen American Graffiti, he wasn't going to do Jaws. And he said, well, I'm going to have to take whatever work I can get because I sucked so bad in American Graffiti. I'm never going to work again. So he basically takes the part because he thinks his career is basically over.
That's all he's good for, kind of thing.
Yeah, and you've got Roy Scheider, who I don't really know a lot about at that point, but he's also relatively unknown at the time as well. So you've got this fascinating dynamic that the play explores of not only the three men who are, comparing scars and talking about their experiences and how they're going to defeat the shark, but you've got the parallels of their careers, their humanity, Robert Shaw's alcoholism, particularly.
Particularly when they're recounted and acted by his son.
Richard Nixon in the newspapers.
Yes, yeah, exactly.
You got a whole Watergate.
References to what's going on outside in the outside world and everything. So it's a very nice companion piece. It's a lovely little fascinating companion piece that goes along with Jaws. And I guess does give more of an insight into the process and who those actors were and where they were in their lives when they came to make this.
Yeah, and there's an equal kind of, should we call it dick measuring kind of aspect to that, isn't there, between the three actors as there is between the three characters in the film? Well, obviously they're very different people, and they're competing about different sorts of things, being actors. But it's these three men weighing each other up and teasing each other and ribbing each other, and also bonding.
And of course, the great thing about the play is that we know that what they're involved with is like one of the great cinematic classics. Whatever you think of it, it's undeniably a great cinematic classic. And when you're watching the theatrical version of it, it's like, well, you're in that, and we know that, and there's no way out of it. And there's a wonderful moment when I think the Brody Scheider actor says, "Well, hey, they're talking about maybe a possible sequel here," which is before the film is finished, which of course would have happened. I'm sure it would have happened. And Ian Shaw, as Robert Shaw, says, well, there's not much more to say, is there? It's like, I remember me and John like roaring with laughter. It's like, well, yeah. I mean, what else is there to say after this first film? Because when you think about the sequels, really, what do any of them add?
Yeah, there's a joke in The Shark is Broken as well about making some theme park with dinosaurs in it, and what a silly idea that would be as well. So there are jokes about Spielberg's future. And
the thing is, there are 12 films this year coming out about sharks. 2023, minimal, including the Meg 2, directed by Ben Wheatley.
Oh wow!
That is what is fucking happening this year. So
I need to read up about that. That's insane.
Yeah, and I don't know. When is it made a good film? I don't know. Is Meg 2 going to be good? Of course not. But for fuck's sake, if you're talking about, well, what impact did Jaws have? Well, 12 films in 2023 is the impact it's made.
Yeah.
And they're all going to be shit. Maybe one or two, okay. Like The Shallows is good, I think.
But I think this is why Jaws, not just Jaws the film, but Jaws the movie phenomenon continues to fascinate us. Yeah. And I'm always reminded of the William Goldman line where he says, nobody knows anything. And that's why you get sequels, because no one in Hollywood knows what's going to be a success and what's not. Everything's a gamble. Yeah. So all they know is that something is more likely to be a success if it's already been a success. Yeah. There's another quote I found when I was looking up various kind of contemporaneous reviews and things. Gilbert Adair in Sight and Sound was writing about someone else entirely. It might have been John Huston or someone. And he was visiting Universal Studios, and he said, if at first you succeed, try again. This might be the motto of Universal Studios, the most successful in Hollywood today. For the obligatory Jaws 2 sharks are rolling off the assembly line, bland as automobiles. And as we know, Jaws opened and was the highest grossing movie of its time. Of course there was going to be a sequel, whether it was necessary or not. Around the same time, you've got, contemporaneously, you've got Rocky becomes a huge success, spawning, Rocky 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, and Creed 3 we're now up to. So
we're still working through
it's like, this is never going to end.
Which is fine, because if Homer and his followers want to keep telling stories about Hercules, then fine. If they're good stories, I don't mind.
Now there it is. There's the rub, isn't it?
Are they good stories?
There's the rub.
Well, that's the question.
I think we're going to settle this one tonight. Just wanted to briefly, I can't believe I didn't mention this before when we were talking about the Indianapolis speech, but I just wanted to get you guys' thoughts on the sort of, again, beautiful darkness of, because I'd forgotten that speech ends with Quint saying with sort of a sort of dejected satisfaction, anyway, we delivered the bomb. Like that, all those men died and suffered and were lost, and he's dealt with this trauma, and what they were doing, their mission, the successful mission, was to get the A-bomb delivered to Japan, basically. I mean, what does Quint feel about that? They don't, obviously they beautifully don't go into that, but that's a hell of a line, isn't it? It's an uppercut of a line.
It's a thing that has for decades haunted me, and that's the thing that matters. Well, we delivered the bomb. That's the thing that matters. We changed geo-global politics through the power of physics. That's really what mattered. And to the side was this awful trauma of 700-800 people. But Hiroshima killed 120,000 people in the first second. It's absolutely fucking brilliant that they leave it hanging.
Yeah.
It's like, well, what's worse? What's worse? Because you need to think about this. What's worse, my empathy for Robert Shaw as a fictional character in this film, or what actually fucking happened?
Yeah.
And we all know where our feelings should really go. But where do they go in terms of watching fiction?
But also, crucially, that's a man-made apocalypse. That is destruction of a purely human creation, whereas what they're fighting is a primordial force of nature. So those two things butting up against each other is very very impactful.
Well, gentlemen, I mean, so much to say still, but I've really enjoyed this chat, and I just John, would you like to have any, knowing that you'll be back in a few days, of course, would you like to have any sort of summing up thoughts in the presence of Simon about Jaws?
I don't know what to say. I don't know what to say to summarize what we've just been over, because we've covered an awful lot of ground. Just a couple of things to mention. So I sent you over that review that I found in the
James Monaco.
Yeah, James Monaco. I know, mad.
Who's written great books about cinema?
Yeah, but one of my
textbooks. Did he write How to Watch a Movie? Did he write?
It's How to Read a Film. Did he write
Cinema of Loneliness?
Or he might have done. But anyway, How to Read a Film, and he wrote the original review. So I sent you that. Did I want to quote some more Spielberg? Yes, I do. So I guess I'm going to leave my last comments with Spielberg again, because I think this comes back to a lot of what we've been talking about, the characters. And in the same interview, he said, "It's almost like I'm directing the audience with a cattle prod. I have very mixed feelings about my work on that picture. I saw it again and realized it was the simplest movie I had ever seen. It was just the essential moving working parts of suspense and terror, with just enough character development that at one point in the movie you hate Scheider and you hate Shaw and you hate Dreyfus within the roles that they're playing, and then you like them again. We would get into these very deep conversations about everyone's motivation and why they were born to fight the shark, and go out next morning and kiss their wives goodbye and duel with the deep. And then I saw the movie last week and I realized that what we were talking about were the basic primitive instincts man has about things that he doesn't understand and is afraid of. We were talking about things that go bump in the night.
Wonderful. Well, that's a great note.
And just to say as well, so Simon, you've got your Jaws poem, which would be lovely to include.
I don't know if I knew about this.
Any points?
This is good.
Yeah.
What? Well, I don't know if I need to know any more than that. That's perfect.
No, that's it.
I mean, I have back in 2010, 2011, I wrote a book called Neptune Blue. It was published by Soul Publishing, and I wrote a sequence of poems called Something Heart. So it's like Hindenburg Heart, Pizza Heart, Wrigley's Heart, various kind of things. And a few years later, I kept writing these poems, and I wrote one called Orca Heart about Quint, Orca, and Jaws. And they're all kind of like weird love poems. And this poem, Orca Heart, was published in a magazine called Painted Spoken, edited by Richard Price, who's a great poet. He's not the screenwriter, Richard Price, who wrote Life Lessons and The Color of Money. So I have this, I do have that poem, if you want to hear it at some point, and maybe you can just like use it as like a little intro thing. It's very short. I'm
not going to let you go without you reading that poem.
Should I just read it and you can use it at some point?
This is the sort of caliber of guests we should have more often, John. This is so he's an all-round entertainer.
It's kind of a love poem set in the last moments of Quint's life. And it refers back to his first appearance, which is the fingernails on the blackboard. It's called Orca Heart. I feel safe because I know your teeth will bend right back as they encircle me, but in they go. And now the quicks of all 10 nails are gone from scraping the splintered deck. You have the better half of me. Who thought you'd be so inflexible? I'll never put on a life jacket again. There you go. It's a little Jaws love poem for you.
Love it. Love it.
All right.
That's wonderful.
That's over anyway. So yeah, good.
Simon, it's been an absolute pleasure having you to talk about it. Would you like to give a final word about Jaws and your quite obvious passion?
God, no, but the thing is, I'm currently writing a long rambling piece about kind of like a fantasy memoir of the 70s, and Jaws is in there. I'm talking with you guys. I'm like, well, maybe after this I can stop thinking about it.
I don't think you will.
I absolutely fucking love it, but do I want to go and think about it? I don't know.
I guarantee, Simon, next time we've had a couple of drinks.
That's it. I love you guys. Let's go swimming.
Perfect note. Simon, John's not much of a social media guy, but I've obviously got the Twitter account for this, and I do Twitter a bit myself. I should have said if you want, it's completely optional, but if you want to do a little plug for yourself and your social media presence and what you're doing at the moment, then feel free to do that now. Okay, yeah. Well, I've got like simonbarraclough.com is my website. Simon Barraclough LDN is my Instagram. That's probably the best places to go. But yeah, thank you. So been really happy to chat to John and Simon about that. It's been a real pleasure, and hope to return with part 2 of this conversation with another guest. So look out for that one. But for now, say ta-ra, John. Ta-ra, John. Thank you. Perfect. And Simon, say goodbye to the folks. Bye-bye. Good luck with Jaws 2. And goodbye from me. See ya. You've been listening to the EscapeGoat podcast, hosted by David Fagiani. If you want to contact the podcast with any feedback or thoughts, you can leave comments on our Libsyn page or under our YouTube videos, or email us at escapegoatpod@gmail.com. You can also reach the show on Twitter on @egoat_pod and follow us for new episode notifications. This podcast is available on YouTube, Apple Podcasts and Spotify, as well as our Libsyn site, escapegoatpodcast.libsyn.com. Original intro, outro, and any other incidental music for this podcast is composed, produced, and made available by permission of Richard Gilbert.